So for the last year, the YouTuber Cash Jordan has been fear-mongering about crime and immigration by using thumbnails that show events that never actually happened in real life. That's because he's taking advantage of the YouTube algorithm by using AI-generated photos of events that don't actually exist, which, alongside sensational titles, make it seem like it's pretty scary down here in the New York subway.
So this is a gentleman known on the internet.com as Rob Robinson, and I just want to say, before we get into all the different various ways that Rob Robinson is wrong, I do like the fact that his last name is a derivative of his first name, because I think that happens to be a very clever, memorable naming convention. And honestly, if you were a criminal who killed an innocent person and Kim Kardashian was representing you, you would be a member of the illiterati. But of course, Rob Robinson is one of these people who has decided that they are going to debunk, they are going to defeat, they are going to destroy Cash Jordan, a popular YouTuber who talks about some of the same things that I talk about, for a number of reasons, including the fact that he is sowing hysteria about violence in the subway, and in addition to that, he has bad arguments against congestion pricing, because this is yet another person who has cropped up from the mud to defend a tax on drivers without actually knowing anything about the subject matter, and of course, making a bunch of errors in their attempt to debunk somebody. So before we get into this, I just want to say that my friend Devin Tracy, recently his parents lost their home during the California wildfires. At one point in time I said the Chicago wildfires, and he has started a GoFundMe in order to raise money to help his family get back on their feet. I will link that fundraiser in the top of the description of this video. If you can support him, please do. If you don't want to, or you can't, no problem, don't worry about it, no pressure. But without further ado, let us get into this video.
Just look at the kind of views that he's getting on these videos. 1.8 million, 4.2 million. He's making a lot of money and getting a lot of views based off of these thumbnails, which show things that never even happened in real life and are totally fake.
Now, I just want to say right off the top that I'm not intending on bullying Rob Robinson, not because I'm against bullying or anything of the sort. It's actually because I watched this person's video, I could tell he put a lot of thought into it, and there is actually some good information and good ethical questions, like whether or not it is acceptable to have AI images in your thumbnail to depict events that actually didn't happen. And he points this out early on in this video a couple of times in a lot of actually humorous ways, so I do want to give credit where credit is due in this regard, because that's an interesting conversation.
The migrant crisis just hit NYC schools, ... Hey, what does that sign say? Vil poopy taub vil pilnity? Absolutely classic NYC migrant behavior depicted in this thumbnail. They are constantly going around protesting outside of empty school buses in the middle of the streets of Manhattan, ranting and raving about their Bill Poopy Taub Vilpilnity.
That being said, I couldn't help but notice that Robbie Robinson is somebody who says that they moved into the borough of Manhattan recently, and I couldn't help but notice that the perspective being presented is somebody who doesn't really know anything about New York City, and I'm not saying you have to live here to know, but a basic amount of research definitely would have assisted this individual prior to making this video. And in fact, he goes after Cash Jordan for a lot of things that are just not true, that turn out to be 100% true and by the numbers, and our buddy Robbie Robinson actually is misstating the facts and figures in this particular video that he's making, supposedly debunking Cash Jordan.
Which is why ridership remains stubbornly low, with levels still lower than what they were back in 2019. Subway ridership is only 65% of what it was back in 2019. That's 5 years ago.
First of all, that's wrong, because the subway ridership as of the day that you put this video out was at 85%, not 65%.
So this is one of the bad debunkings that I saw right here from Robbie Robinson, and I'm going to explain to you exactly where I think he made the error, because I don't think this error was made in bad faith. So there is a number that is floating around that advocates for congestion pricing have put forward that says 85% of the people who commute to Lower Manhattan do not use a vehicle to do so. And what a coincidence. The number that is thrown out by Robbie Robinson for subway ridership, which I believe he is confusing for that number, is that 85%. Now, Cash Jordan makes the claim that subway ridership is down 65% from the pandemic levels, or the pre-pandemic levels of 2019. But when we go to the MTA's data, what we discover is that it's actually in and around 68%. However, the numbers even there are a little bit deceptive, because when you break it down to weekdays versus weekends, what what you find out is that weekend subway ridership has recovered to 77% of pre-pandemic levels. However, weekday ridership, which is the majority of commuters for work, actually has gone to 66%, which is much closer to Cash Jordan's 65% than, of course, Robbie Robinson's 85%, which I believe represents that number that is floating around on Twitter.com and all these different other social media sites that, of course, congestion pricing advocates are pushing, which has nothing to do with anything compared to pre-pandemic levels. Do we understand? Do we get what I'm explaining right here? Do you understand what I'm putting down? Now, by the way, I did look at some of the preliminary numbers because the complete numbers from the MTA weren't published as of 2024, and it seemed like in a couple of months they got up to around 70% of pre-pandemic ridership, but nowhere near the 85% number that is put forward by Robbie Robinson. So he's just wrong in that regard.
New Yorkers are avoiding the subway like the plague. And nobody who runs the subway is curious to figure out exactly why that's happening. But I'll tell you why it is. It's dangerous down here. And people don't want to risk their life every day when they're just trying to go to work and provide for their families. That's not a good idea.
So right off the bat, you are wrong about this. And I don't know why transit crime is like so inflated in our understanding of safety in the public realm. But as it turns out, evidence indicates that it's actually a little bit safer to be in the subway than it is to be in other parts of our public realm. So why we fixate on transit crime, I do not know.
So right here when Cash Jordan is discussing crime in the New York City subways, Robbie Robinson does an excellent crime denial tactic that has become very common among people who are supportive of the congestion pricing tax, which is show B-roll of footage of car accidents and then make the case that it's more dangerous in other areas in the city of New York. But for some reason, for some illegitimate reason is the implication, we tend to focus on subway crime. And again, I'm not trying to bully Robbie Robinson because it turns out he just got here yesterday. He knows not of what he speaks because in reality, subway crime and the decrease in subway ridership correlate quite strongly. And despite the fact that the head of the MTA says crime actually down 12%, when you look at the numbers, what you realize is that the property crimes, the ones that are committed supposedly and allegedly due to poverty, somebody arrests poverty, whenever we get a description of what poverty is wearing, we will put an APB out. The violent crimes, the most serious crimes, are actually up dramatically in the subway. Again, look at the CompStat numbers for the transit system. You have murder, again, as compared to 2019, up 233%. You have rape, again, compared to 2019, up by 66.7%. You have felony assault, up by 51.6%. You have burglary, up by 85%. However, robbery and grand larceny, the two less serious crimes on this list, because they represent a greater raw number of the overall whole in terms of crimes, are down, so they can tell you that crime is down 12.7%, despite the fact that the most serious crimes are up. And again, I've talked about this article many a times, and I will bring it up yet again. There were more people murdered in the New York City subway from 2020 to about April of 2024 than the previous 15 years. We actually have an updated version of that stat that says more people were killed in the subway from 2020 to 2025 than the previous 20 years. So yeah, the reason why people are concerned about crime in the subway is because crime is up compared to what it was previously in the subway. That is the issue that people have. You can talk about car accidents all you want, but that doesn't change the fact that people who have ridden the subway have noticed a decline in quality of people and increase in crime in the subway. Again, this distraction deflection technique is just not sensible. It's ridiculous. It denies what people are actually experiencing, and of course, it denies the numbers. In addition to that, I will also point out that car accidents are in fact accidents. Murders are in fact murders. There's a reason why we are more concerned about murders than we are about accidents, because accidents tend to happen. There may be ways to prevent or mitigate those, which by the way, we do, and we put a lot of focus on it. Seatbelts, airbags, safety testing for vehicles, stop signs, red lights, red light cameras, speed cameras, all these different various things, traffic enforcement and all that in order to prevent that. But homicides, we're not working enough to prevent prevent those. In fact, we have laws like bail reform that release repeat offenders time and time again until they eventually kill somebody, and that has proven to be disastrous. So again, we have a problem that stems from a law that came into place in 2020. It's called bail reform. It has led to negative consequences disproportionately in the subway, and the fact that you could be more likely to die in a car accident, again, an accident, doesn't change the fact that people who have ridden the subway for a long time, people who didn't move into Manhattan just yesterday, know the difference between the subway 10 years ago and the subway right now.
The real reason this whole system is failing is so simple. Our tax-addicted progressive leaders can't seem to put their finger on it.
Okay, so I'm confused by your point that our
Tax-addicted progressive leaders can't seem to
put their finger on the issue of fare evasion, because you've talked about the MTA's recent and pretty extensive efforts in terms of fare evasion multiple times in your video.
Except for these new evasion-resistant gates, they've got these new barriers to keep you from putting your hands on it and bracing yourself as you hop over, which is a big improvement. This entrance is pretty secure. Right through that door, you've got police and you've got National Guard, and our leaders know that weapons and violence in the subway is a huge problem. Progressive leaders can't seem to put their finger on it. The police catch so many people, seem to put their finger on it, and our leaders know finger on it.
So you're just ignoring the fact that they actually have been putting a lot of effort into fare evasion and doing the exact things that you recommended, investing in new turnstiles in their new capital plan.
These new evasion-resistant gates, which is a big improvement.
And increasing the police presence at turnstiles.
This entrance is pretty secure. Right through that door, you've got police and you've got National Guard.
Like, they're doing what you're asking, bro.
So right here, Robbie Robinson is very upset that Cash Jordan is talking about how the New York City government, the New York state government aren't doing enough about fare evasion. And then he talks about all these different various things, these security gates. We recently heard about a spiky thing that when you reach over to jump the turnstiles, they installed. And then he goes on to make an actually pretty salient point, which is that fare evasion is actually a bigger problem on the buses than it is on the subway in terms of percentage of people not paying the fares.
The losses from fare evasion add up to $700 million.
Cash, you make it sound like this is a subway problem, when in reality, fare evasion is not exclusively confined to the subways. As it turns out, it's actually much less of a problem on the subway than it is on the bus. A much higher proportion of people don't pay their fares on the bus, and the actual amount of money that is lost to fare evasion on the bus is way greater. It's $285 million a year for the subway and $315 million for the bus. So why are we focusing so hard on the subway? Eliminating fare evasion in the subway would not generate $700 million in free money for the MTA.
So one of the reasons why I try not to go too hard on this Robbie Robinson kid is because he's actually trying to make logical, reasonable arguments. However, he doesn't have a dynamic form of thinking. He has a very flat form of thinking. So he's talking about how it costs money to deploy officers in order to fight fare evasion.
I think you forgot that preventing fare evasion costs money. It really serves your narrative to claim that the only reason the MTA doesn't have police officers stationed outside of every single turnstile in the subway 24 hours a day is because our liberal leaders are too weak to punish the criminals. But you actually have to pay for those people to sit outside of those turnstiles.
And how, you could end up in a situation where the officers are actually taking up more money than you're recovering from preventing people from jumping the turnstiles or not paying for the buses. And while this is in fact technically true, the fact of the matter is he is not factoring in deterrence. And one of the reasons why I know he's not factoring in deterrence is what he says right here.
The MTA has to strike a balance when it comes to fare evasion. They have to be spending less than $2.90 per stolen fare in order for it to be worthwhile to them financially. So your narrative that congestion pricing is bad and we wouldn't need it if only our liberal leaders would grab the pile of free money that is evaded tolls and fares is just not rooted in reality. Like, we can have an argument about whether the MTA is balancing their investments into preventing fare evasion correctly, but it's not true that it's just free money that would pay for the benefits of congestion pricing if we didn't do congestion pricing.
So I guess this is not technically wrong that you need to spend less than $2.90, the current fare for the subway or the bus, although the express bus costs more money, but let's just set that aside for now, in order to have a positive impact on the tax base overall. But the fact of the matter is, the implication from the way that he's phrasing this is that you need to spend less than $2.90 per arrest, which is actually not the case, because again, it doesn't factor in deterrence and it doesn't acknowledge the previous history that we had in the city of New York. In fact, he actually scoffs at the idea that you would put people in jail for fare evasion.
In this video, you argued that fare evaders should be arrested and serve time in jail. Seriously.
Still, though, you'd also stop fare evasion pretty quickly if the people who were caught jumping ended up spending time in jail.
But one of the greatest fare evasion crackdowns in history happened under William Bratton in the early 90s to late 80s, and guess what? It was based on the idea that you would put people in jail. So in 1990, when William Bratton was installed as the head of the transit cops for the MTA in particular, he decided that he was going to implement a crackdown on fare evasion. Now, the aim of this crackdown was actually not wholly about reducing people jumping the turnstiles or avoiding paying for the buses and whatnot. It was actually to search and get people who were going to pop for weapons and warrants based on the idea that somebody who's going to violate the big norm when they get into the interior of the city by robbing and assaulting people probably doesn't care about the little norm, which is paying for the subway. And at that moment in time when he took office, there was about 170,000 to 200,000 people jumping the turnstiles or fare evading daily in the transit system. So Bratton initiates the crackdown. They decide to bring processing, arrest people, ticket them, send them to jail for fare evasion, and what ultimately ended up happening is that 200,000 people that were jumping the turnstiles a day or fare evading per day reduced to just 45,000 people. Now this is a 75% reduction in fare evasion that happened over the course of 2 years, and obviously they didn't arrest 155,000 people per day every day in the city of New York in order to achieve it. What happened is they started arresting people. Word got out that you could spend a night in jail for not paying for the subway, for not paying for the bus, and guess what? The overwhelming majority, 3/4 of people, ended up paying for the subway and the bus. And when I say 3/4 of people, I mean 3/4 of the people who were previously not paying, who were previously jumping the turnstiles, who were previously boarding the bus again without paying for the bus, decided that they weren't going to do that anymore because the cost wasn't worth it. However, there were also additional benefits to this, because when this program was initiated, what Bratton ended up finding out is that 1 out of 7 people who were jumping the turnstiles actually popped for a felony warrant. In addition to that, you also were able to find illegal weapons on, I believe, 1 out of 20 people. And again, during this same period of time, the downstream consequences were also that subway felonies fell by 27% and robberies fell by 30% during this period of time when the crackdown was initiated, because it turns out, yes, the bad actors, the people who violate the big norms in the city of New York, are also the same people who don't want to pay for the subway, or at least people who don't want to pay the subway are more likely to violate other norms. Now, you could initiate a crackdown of similar proportions and get a similar result in our current transit system, except for a few things. And the first and most obvious one is New York State bail reform. There is no point of arresting somebody and trying to send them to jail if they're guaranteed a same-day automatic release by New York State bail reform law. So instead of getting a 75% reduction in the lost revenue, which by the way is $700 million, 75% of that, which is $525 million, we end up leaving all that money on the table because we quite literally are incapable, no matter how much overtime we pay to officers, of initiating a similar quality of crackdown, because there are no consequences to deter people from fare evading. So while this guy's like, whoa, you actually want to put people in jail? Are you crazy? Casey, you can't jail that many people. I say, yes, I do want to put people in jail. And by the way, I know for a fact you don't need to jail that many people because we already experienced this before. And again, the numbers that he showed are absolutely staggering. 47% of the people that ride the city buses don't pay for the buses. That's almost half of them. Again, about 1.4 million people, according to the MTA, ride city buses each and every day. And I'm talking about commuter days. Obviously, it's different on weekends. And if half of them aren't paying, that's almost 700,000 people. And for the subway, it might seem like it's better because, you know, it's only like 14% of the people not paying. But remember, that's 14% of 3.6 million people. Now, that's about 500,000 people per day, which, by the way, is something that was not taken into account by Robbie Robinson when he said, oh, fare evasion is not as big of a problem in the subway as it is in the bus, even though, again, in the subway, there's way more riders. So the numbers, even though it's 14% to 47%, are actually much closer than you think, or much closer than the impression that you get from a 47% of fare evasion on the buses to, again, 14% fare evasion on the subway, because, again, the subway rider base is just more people. So yeah, this is a lot of money that they are leaving on the table by not jailing people, by operating under the premise that it costs more than an individual fare to jail somebody, not factoring in the deterrence effect. And again, even if you say, for whatever reason, if we try to implement this today, there's no way we would get a 75% reduction in fare evasion like we saw in the 90s. By the way, the highest crime period in American history, when the American people were much more criminal. For some reason, now it's just unworkable. Even if you got a 50% reduction, that is still $350 million in the pockets of the MTA, again, at the cost of arresting very few people. In addition to that, you can also fine these people a certain amount in order to compensate for the cost of their individual arrests. So no, you don't have to arrest, process, and jail somebody for under $2.90. What you're doing is arresting, prosecuting, and jailing people. Hopefully they also have felony warrants, so it's even more worth it to do so in order to send a message to other people that fare evasion will not be tolerated, and there's a chance that you will be arrested and jailed for it, which of course you're hoping has the downstream effect of deterring them from that behavior going forward. And again, it worked in the 90s, a more criminal period than we are in right now. There's no reason to believe that it wouldn't work now, but this guy doesn't want to try it, and a bunch of people who think that they're smarter than they actually are have all these calculations that don't take into the effect that when you change up the law, when you change up the rules, people change their behavior to adapt. Will say, oh, this costs too much police overtime, definitely not worth it.
In this video, you argued that fare evaders should be arrested and serve time in jail. Seriously.
So everything he said about fare evasion is wrong-headed. It is improper. I understand what led him to believe those things. This is something that is often presented this way to the public, despite the fact that it is full of fallacies. But another thing that I want to address is the idea that we're supposed to get tax benefits, like an increase in net revenue from the congestion pricing, when in reality, there is no reason to believe that's the case. Sure, you have a toll of $9 below 60th Street, and the cars that end up below 60th Street, of course, will pay that $9 toll. But the fact of the matter is, part of the point of congestion pricing is that you are expecting to reduce traffic in and around those areas. And considering the MTA already gets money from tolls from the Queens Midtown Tunnel, from tolls from the Battery Park Tunnel, from tolls from the Lincoln Tunnel and the Holland Tunnel, all which dump into 60th Street, a reduction in drivers actually means a reduction in those tolls paid at all those various points. So already right there, you might end up with a net loss in revenue rather than a net increase in revenue. And that's not even factoring in the other state taxes or city taxes that you're going to actually have to lose out on. So right now there is reporting early on that parking garages are actually down capacity about 28%. And this is for the entire borough of Manhattan. And I will point out it is early on into this process, so you should take this with a grain of salt as of right now. And again, we will see the real numbers coming forward a little bit later. But the fact of the matter is, like he said, in terms of going after fare evasion and the money that you spend on that, you have to balance the lost revenue versus the increase in revenue from the $9 toll and see if that makes sense. So in the borough of Manhattan, it actually costs 18.375% in terms of taxes for when you park in one of these garages. So a reduction in capacity of 30% at every one of these garages could also be a very dramatic loss in terms of tax revenue for the city of New York and for the state of New York. Because again, that combination of taxes that reach up to that 18.375% is a combination of city and state taxes. So we could very well find ourselves in a situation where the net tax revenue from the congestion pricing actually goes down and not up. Therefore, all the benefits of money going to the transit system are greatly overstated. And in fact, while the MTA is happy to drop all these different various numbers about how traffic times have improved, and by the way, I said this in my first video on congestion pricing, that this would actually work in reducing congestion, in reality, they're being kind of shady when it comes to the toll revenue. And the reason for that is because there is a very high probability, due to the change in behavior, that you're going to see a net tax revenue decrease rather than an increase based on this program. And this makes sense. You can't get blood from a stone. They tax New Yorkers already at crazy degrees. That changes behavior, and that has very devastating consequences. And this individual, by the way, has talked about how he's moved into Manhattan again just last week. But one of the things that you'll notice at about a bunch of these different parking garages is that they are attached to buildings that often have other occupants in it. Those are tenants. And guess what? When those parking lots become unworkable, when they can't actually make the revenue to pay the rent at those buildings, that building is going to have to compensate by raising rents on all the different various people that live in Manhattan. This is yet another way, by the way, that congestion pricing, even if poor people don't drive in New York City, can have negative downstream effects on lower and middle income people. And for those of you who are going to say, Sean, there's not a lot of poors that live in Manhattan, what are you even talking about? The fact of the matter is, we have a bunch of different units, over 1 million units in New York City as a whole, that are held below market value due to rent control or rent stabilization. So yeah, in a bunch of these new buildings, you have apartments that are supposed to be held below market levels. And to the anger of a lot of the people in those buildings, Eric Adams has shown a willingness to allow the rent board to have greater increases than normal. And what do you think is going to happen if these parking garages, which are major tenants in these buildings, end up having to shut down, to the pressure on other people's rents, to the pressure on that rental board in order to raise rent? Obviously, you're creating upward pressure on rents. And again, all of this has consequences. One of the things that annoys me so much about the advocates for congestion pricing is that they quite literally participate in magical thinking. They just think, oh, there are less cars in lower Manhattan. That is good. Which, by the way, if your one thing is reducing car congestion on the streets, then I guess it is, but there are also other effects, secondary effects, increases of traffic in other areas, again, decreases in tax revenue in other areas that you don't imagine, increase in costs as trucks and all these other places that have to do deliveries to these businesses in those areas, increases in rent when tenants like parking structures end up not being able to pay. And yeah, we might not see a net increase in revenue for the MTA, and the fact that they're already very dodgy about toll revenue is a huge problem. On top of that, I will also point out, it costs $500 million to run those toll cameras. That's ridiculous.
If this were a private business, it would have closed decades ago, but it's not, so they don't have to think like a private business. Which explains how they can lose $700 million a year across the subway, the bus, and the tolls and bridges, and still be here.
Cash, did you know that you are not the first person to think about this? Because there is a metric called the fare box recovery ratio that's been kept track of by every transit agency of all time ever, and it tracks exactly what you're talking about. And there are 0 rail-based transit systems in the United States that turn more of a profit than they spend. Why? Is it because we just forgot to think about it? Well, there's lots of benefits that you can provide with a public transit system that is focused on providing a good user experience as opposed to generating a profit.
So look, this is one of the lies in American politics that I cannot stand. And it's the idea that, oh, in America, we're not expecting these transit systems to make a profit, so everybody needs to shut up about that. Now, I've talked about how the Paris Metro makes a profit. The London Metro makes a profit. The Japanese Metro, the Tokyo one, makes a profit. The Korean one, by the way, there's some controversy controversy about how much money it loses each and every year, because the taxpayers do care about that, doesn't make a profit, but that's specifically because they go out of their way to subsidize certain rides for elderly people and for students. So again, that one is a bit more excusable as compared to the MTA, which only generates about 23% of its revenue from the fares that it charges. So again, it runs a deficit when you combine all those other factors into the MTA's budget, but clearly fares alone are not covering the costs of this operation that has become a boondoggle.
When you hand over public utilities to private companies, they consistently cut costs as much as possible in order to generate high profits, creating a worse user experience. We've seen this happen in industry after industry, and we've even seen it happen with privatizing transit.
And this guy condemns private companies for trying to maximize profits by cutting back on things that make the user experience better. And I will just ask anybody if they think the public MTA does a good job with user experience. And I will also remind you that the MTA, before New York City bought the subways, was actually 3 different private subway companies that did make a profit, that did have top of the line train stations and signaling systems and all of that, all for profit, again, before the city bought them. It's only after the city bought them that they started hemorrhaging money because it became a jobs program. Now, by the way, many of the most advanced metros in the world are either run by a private company or run in conjunction with a private company, and they have way better user experiences. And this guy's talking about handing over public infrastructure to private companies. It was infrastructure that was built by private companies that was bought by the public. And here's what happens when the public buys it. They spend all this money, waste all this money on fancy new stations that go way over budget, like the WTC station, which of course hired a famed Spanish architect to build something to look like it has the illusion of whale bones. It was $2 billion over budget. It's quite literally one stop, and it came 17 years after 9/11, which, by the way, this was just to rebuild the station that was destroyed during the terrorist attacks. While at the same time, and I know you guys have heard me say this too much, they never improved things like the signaling system, which is 100 years old in the subway system, which, by the way, would allow us to actually know where the trains are on the tracks so that we could run more trains and more efficiently. But the MTA doesn't care about efficiency because, spoiler alert, efficiency is something that leads to profit, and they're not in the game for profit. So everything the MTA does is for politicians to show up for a ribbon cutting ceremony, not actually to improve the user experience, not actually to, improve the performance and efficiency of the subways, but to improve the political perception of whatever politician is in power. Take the Second Avenue line. Again, they only finished 3 stops on the Second Avenue line. It was meant to replace a high line that was taken down in, I think, 1912. The original proposal was in 1920 to put in the underground Second Avenue line. It ended up getting completed under Andrew Cuomo, so almost 100 years later. And when I say completed, I mean phase 1 of it was completed, which was the first 3 stops. And we're supposed to celebrate that as if that makes any sense, when if you were a private company and you spent 100 years building 3 train stations, you would be laughed out of town. So yeah, the idea that the public experience is way better is absurd. We've been living under the public mismanagement of the MTA for a very long time, and they have proven totally inadequate in order to do this job. And by the way, we have one of the most, in terms of the tunneling system, sophisticated transit systems in the world. It should be profitable. We have a huge ridership in the city of New York, but the MTA just incinerates your money.
Secondly, the subway system generates massive amounts of wealth for the city and the state that does not come through toll revenues. That's because there's a huge number of business endeavors that would be completely impossible that depend on the subway. Just take the land value increases from being in proximity to a transit line. That alone is enough to offset the cost of fare evasion on the subway.
Now, he does talk about the secondary economic benefits of the transit system, and I will be fair to him, these definitely exist, and maybe, just maybe, it is worthwhile to keep the MTA open, even if it's not making a profit, based on those benefits. Very similar to the Korean system. Again, I'm not immune to the public good argument in a certain respect, but the fact of the matter is, the MTA wastes money on boondoggle after boondoggle, and it's embarrassing. Again, that Second Avenue line had $630 million in administration costs. Administration costs. Just think about how crazy that is. And I talk about the Paris Metro. The Paris Metro is highly unionized. It has a bunch of different regulations. They do more ambitious projects than the New York City transit system. And guess what? Even though they've been known for boondoggles, delays, and corruption, it costs 6 times more for us to dig a mile of tunnel than it does in Paris, France for their metro system, which again is considered one of the most questionable ones in the entire continent of Europe. There's something obviously going wrong with the New York City MTA.
But the problem is that, like most of the money that comes from fees and taxes, when you give it to the agency that runs this place, they're just gonna waste it. And that perfectly explains how 10 years ago, the budget to run this place was about half what it is today. Today it's $20 billion. It used to be around $13 billion.
Cash, I will only listen to your complaining about the MTA's $20 billion a year budget if I hear you first acknowledge these two things. First, the massive spending that we have to do in order to maintain the system today was caused by disinvestment from the subway by generations past, who deferred maintenance that would have been cheap at the time in order to divert that money towards auto-centric suburban sprawl.
So, Robbie, I will not concede that at all whatsoever, because what you're showing me right here, these dramatic cuts, the money that was reduced from the MTA, is $1.5 billion over the course of decades, by the way. Look at the politicians that are listed right there. You have Governor Pataki to Cuomo. I'm guessing this came out when Andrew Cuomo was still the governor. And then you have from Mayor Giuliani, again, somebody who was elected mayor in the early 90s, to Bill de Blasio. This is over the course of a long period of time that the $1.5 billion that you're talking about was supposedly cut from the subway. During the same period of time, by the way, that exact project that I was highlighting, the World Trade Center station, went $2 billion over budget. So again, if they had that money, they likely would have just wasted it because it cost them $4 billion to rebuild a station. Do you know how absurd this is? Do you know how ridiculous that is? And you know, the Second Avenue line that had the $600 million in administration costs, those 3 stops that they built cost $6 billion. We didn't need the Second Avenue line station at all whatsoever. It didn't need to be there. It was to replace a train that went out of commission, again, 100 years prior to the construction of this line. And guess what? People had found a way to adapt in the century that it was gone. So right there, just in the waste, in the over budget, which by the way, $2 billion was already too much money for the replacement of the WTC station. Make no mistake about it. That is $8 billion in fancy projects specifically for ribbon cutting. The idea that I'm going to say the MTA was perfectly fine to not do maintenance because of that money that was supposedly cut over the course of 20 years when they incinerated far more money on just these 2 projects is insane and asinine. And again, no private company would sacrifice the efficiency of the trains, which is what brings people into the train station, in order to build a fancy new station that, by the way, is already losing money. The Westfield Mall has to be sued by the MTA to not leave because they want to get the hell out of that WTC station because the crime and the theft is too high and it's not profitable to be there. It's a total disaster. It's a total boondoggle. And the crazy thing is we have an entire Simpsons episode about this, the monorail episode. And guess what? At least that guy had the decency to skip town after he scammed the city. The MTA never leaves. And the next thing that he shows is, again, patently absurd. So again, the second screenshot that he shows says that they cut $500 million from signal fixing projects, which again shows you a misallocation of funding, not a reduction in funding. And the reason why we know that is because all the money that's cut that he shows right here still fits in with the $2 billion in overrun from just the World Trade Center Path Station rebuild. Just that is all the money that he's talking about that was supposedly cut from the system. It wasn't cut. It was reallocated to dumbass projects. So again, it's not a funding problem for the MTA. It's the fact that they keep wasting the money. And it even says it right here. It was cut in favor of projects that Andrew Cuomo favored, aka ribbon cutting projects like the Second Avenue line, because you best believe Andy Cuomo was over there when that station opened, and of course the WTC station. Now again, this guy talks about cuts and defunding of the MTA, which never happened, by the way. Let's make it 100% clear about that. There was no disinvestment in the MTA, and a perfect example of the fact that he is being betrayed by his own sourcing is right here. You see the $1 billion number in lost revenue, but that is actually blamed on the fact that they are so dependent on other forms of taxation, and specifically during the financial crisis, these real estate transaction taxes that the MTA gets a piece of, they dropped dramatically. Again, so they lost money based on the fact that they're not self-sufficient. They don't make enough money on their fares. Again, if they were more self-sufficient, you wouldn't have this issue. And he talks about how, it got redirected to suburban sprawl and auto-centric whatever. What the hell are you talking about? That did not happen. Again, the MTA didn't lose money. They just spent it on dumbass projects. They didn't do regular ordinary maintenance. They had the money. What you just showed me right here is that they definitely had the money in just the World Trade Center path project.
So we subsidized things that were not the subway. We let the subway deteriorate and get worse and worse, and now the cost of repairing it has gotten much larger than it would have been if we had just repaired it at the time.
First of all, the biggest portion of the MTA's budget is staffing. It's salaries. It makes up something like 60% of this. So it's not gotten more and more expensive to actually maintain the subway and its components, 100-year-old signaling system and all. It's gotten more expensive to employ all of these people. Now, by the way, to give credit to Robbie Robinson, he does call out some of the boondoggles in the MTA, but he doesn't make the connection here. He doesn't understand that the dollar amounts that he's saying were stripped out over time from Giuliani to de Blasio are completely overwhelmed by just the boondoggle aspects of 2 MTA projects. 2 projects overwhelm that. Now look, you guys know I'm gonna bring up the $100 million elevators because I think it's absolutely crucial. Because again, Robbie Robinson's argument is that the user experience would get much, much worse if this were privatized. But again, name me a private company that is completely inaccessible to handicapped people at 72% of their locations that isn't already being sued into the ground under the Americans for Disabilities Act, because the MTA only has 28% of their stations that are handicapped accessible, and one of the reasons why is because it cost them $100 million to build an elevator. Again, we went over this announcement for a capital improvement plan where they allocated $5.5 billion to build 70 elevators. That's around $80 million as the starting budget for the MTA for those elevators. And again, I will point out, they always go over budget. Look, I'm not trying to make this about whether or not we should privatize the MTA, but if you're going to argue against it, don't tell me that the private company would just do all these overruns and it would be just crazy because they're prioritizing profit. No private company builds an elevator for $100 million. Only the government could spend that much money on an elevator. I just want you guys to think of all the elevators you've ever been in your entire life and count on your hand right now. The answer is going to be 0. How many of them you think costs $100 million? Again, unless, of course, you're riding in an MTA elevator, because that's how they incinerate your money. Again, they are tracking the train's movement on the tracks on pen and paper, while at the same time, they're spending $100 million on an elevator.
Did you know that the construction of the original interstate highway system was funded with a 90% subsidy from the federal government? 90%? That is where the money went that would have gone to funding, subsidizing, and maintaining transit infrastructure in the United States that the people who planned the interstate highway system saw as obsolete.
When you give it to the agency that runs this place, they're just gonna waste it.
Why do we expect that it's normal to subsidize massive amounts of freeway and road infrastructure for suburban areas that cannot turn a profit and is massively unprofitable and unsustainable, and yet we expect that transit is supposed to turn a profit despite the public good that it provides?
So yeah, then this guy makes the greatest error of all time, which is to go after the interstate highway system and talk about how it's not profitable, even though it got 90% of its money from the federal government. And just to be clear, that's just not true. The amount of economic benefit that we get per year from the interstate highway system is about $740 billion. And this is according to multiple studies. And by the way, this is based on a limited impact of just the increased efficiency for being able to travel goods over long distances over land. And also, in addition to that, the interstate highway system made rail cheaper and more efficient in this country as well. Again, I will link to the source of this in the description of this video. But do you know how much it would cost if we had to rebuild the entirety of the interstate highway system today? it would cost $1 trillion in order to do so, which means the economic benefits of the interstate highway system would outweigh the total cost of a rebuild from top to bottom in just 2 years. And this is the major problem I have with people like this. Again, it's nothing personal. It's just that they come at this from this ideology that cars are inherently bad, and if only we got rid of cars and roads and personal freedom, then somehow the subway system would be A+ first class all the way. They don't think dynamically about issues unless it's convenient for them. This guy was perfectly able to think about the cost of actually enforcing fare evasion versus how much you would recoup, but he didn't think about the cost of congestion pricing in terms of reduction in tax revenues and all the other different ways that it could have an impact. And again, this is the problem because they already start from the assumption that car bad, transit good, so more funding to the MTA good, but what we discover with the MTA time and time again is you give them more money and in 6 months, they claim to be bankrupt all over again because they waste the money. It's one of the most corrupt agencies in the entire country. And again, just look at the amount of people that make 6 figures at the MTA. It's absurd. By the way, probably the only agency that competes with them is the Port Authority, which unsurprisingly is another transit agency. But yeah, Robbie, I'm sure you're a nice enough kid. Welcome to New York City, by the way. And I understand you make some good arguments about the public benefits and about the indirect benefits of actually running the subway, which are similar arguments to the ones that I made about the interstate highway system. So to be clear, I understand that, and I understand maybe it's not going to make a profit, but 23% from the revenue that they take in from the actual fares is not good enough. In fact, one of your own articles shows that that makes them vulnerable to other economic issues like a price shock in real estate, and in reality, our transit system shouldn't be that vulnerable to a drop in real estate tax revenue. Again, they should maybe not make all of their money from fares if you want to say the public good is worth it, but maybe 23% is far too little. Maybe they do need to run more efficient, and maybe they need to focus less on grandiose projects, which by the way, as soon as they implemented congestion pricing, they started promising new transit projects rather than the actual maintenance that both of us want them to do, but I actually know that they're wasting the money on things to make politicians happy due to political pressure rather than the things that will make the subway better. Again, one of the craziest things is that the MTA actually has to hire an outside cleaning company to clean the subways because guess what? They can't do it themselves despite the fact that they have the staff to do it, and their staff takes an overwhelming portion of their budget. It is insane how this agency is run, and it's criminal to give them any more money. So yeah, good points about AI thumbnails, good points about construction stuff that are also points that I've emphasized, but tie it all together and understand that yes, deterrence is effective for fare evasion. Anyway, those are just my thoughts. I want to know what you guys think down in the comments below. If you like this video, show them by leaving a like, subscribe for more content, follow me on my social media, support me via the support links in the description of this video. This has been me talking about transit, Cash Jordan, all this crazy stuff. Till next time.